again. So just to let you know, we are recording today, the session, and we'll share that with you later. So welcome along to this online learning with CILIPS Scotland called Fear of the Known, Conspiracy Theories and Misinformation webinar for librarians. I'm Sean McNamara, I'm Director of CILIPS Scotland, and we're also joined by Kirsten McQuarrie from CILIPS Scotland, who's Sector Development Manager, and of course Leah Higgins, our digital assistant, who will be presenting the webinar today. So happy Halloween, also happy Global Media and Information Literacy Week, which is a week that UNESCO lead on, and we've been having various activities this week, and I know many others across the library and information community as well will have participated in some way, or throughout the year will be participating in improving media and information literacy for their users. So that is part of the reason why we were keen to do this webinar as a perhaps kind of interesting take on that idea of information literacy and how we support that, and particularly around conspiracy theories and misinformation, and whether reflecting on that UNESCO toolkit that Leah will tell you more about. So if you can leave your microphones off, if you can, we'll perhaps have time for questions at the end, and we can turn microphones on. Cameras can be on or off. It's totally up to yourself. Cameras off can save bandwidth, but please do see how you feel. We should have captions turned on, so just if you would like to have your captions on, you can toggle them on or off at the bottom. If you have any problems at all, technically or otherwise, then just do put it in the chat. Kirsten and I will be keeping an eye on the chat. We should be able to pick that up and get back to you individually. If you have any questions throughout, then do put them in the chat. We may or may not have time to come to them all at the end, but do put them in, and we'll find a way of answering them one way or another. So I'll not waste any more of Leah's time. I will now pass you over to Leah Higgins, our CILIPS digital assistant, for this webinar. So thanks, Leah. You take it away from here.
Hello, good morning, everyone. As Sean said, my name is Leah Higgins, and I am the CILIPS digital assistant. So welcome to this webinar. Today we are going to explore fear of the known and try to understand more about the intersection between conspiracy theories and misinformation, and also share some practical tools to help empower you as library and information professionals to deal with this topic. Today, I'll give a presentation to really outline the definitions and consequences of conspiracy theories, and hopefully you'll leave with some practical solutions to implement at the end. Throughout the session, I'll be inviting you to add to a mentee slide your reflections and stories. So please don't be shy. It will really help the session and also your own understanding of the topic if you engage with the questions. So I'm just going to cover what we're going to cover in the topic today. So we're going to talk a little bit about a general introduction, talk about the definitions and an introduction to conspiracies, why they're harmful, why people are susceptible to believing in them. And then we'll touch on what a librarian's place is within this discussion. We'll talk about how to identify what is a conspiracy theory versus healthy skepticism. We'll talk about the SIFT strategy. And then finally, we'll finish with what you can do and what some of the takeaways are from this topic. And just a wee bit of a disclaimer that a lot of this is really foundational, and it's about understanding conspiracies on a kind of deeper level. And we won't touch as much on the kind of practical stuff, but there will be a lot of that at the end, because it's only really after we have a solid understanding of the mechanics of conspiracy theories, why they're harmful and why people are susceptible, that we can really begin to look at a librarian's place in dismantling them. And as Sean said, I'm sure there's no doubt that we'll probably do more on this in the future. So yes, so to bring this conversation in line with libraries, I thought I'd share some insight into how this webinar came about. I am a total true crime and conspiracy theory fantasist. Often the books that I'd take out of my local library or the ones that I'd buy from the book fair were conspiracy theory compilations. And if anyone has any book recommendations, please put them in the chat below. I was so intrigued by the mysteries of the unknown, and this is translated into adulthood and amalgamated into love of podcasts. My colleague Kirsten and I often share our latest podcast or Netflix recommendations. And from this, we started on the topic of misinformation and how prevalent this seems to be in these stories. It's quite often the catalyst to many enormous threads of deep conspiracies absolutely strengthened by other factors such as civic mistrust and also the echo chamber of social media. So I've got some podcast recommendations, as I'm sure someone, at least one person in the room, will appreciate them. So in the middle we have hoax, which was really the main one, in which we spoke about how misinformation can turn into an entire conspiracy theory. Got Mariana Springer in the bottom left-hand corner. She has a really great podcast about Why Do You Hate Me USA, and that looks into social media and how that kind of plays a part in all of this. And then another one is Wrongly Accused, which is the story of Annette Higgins. Not as much about misinformation, but it's about the story of injustice, and within it, a local family used their local library to advocate for their family member who has been the victim of injustice in the judicial system. So equally, at a CILIPS event a few months ago, I ended up speaking to someone who shared some great podcast recommendations about this, and also about how the Duolingo bird is a whole entire scam. And this is a rabbit hole that I definitely recommend, but I also regret looking into in the first place. And another member shared the discussion that they had had about having to convince a member of the public that climate change was real. It became increasingly clear in that moment that this was something more than just the podcast that I was listening to. It was having real life consequences for our members as well. And this is an actual photograph of me trying to put this presentation together. So from this, I thought it was crucial to explore the role that librarians and information professionals can play in the role of stopping the misinformation that breeds conspiracy theories in the first place, especially when this type of thinking strikes people young, in schools and on social media. In the context of the last few years too, we've seen an alarming rise in health literacy being undermined by baseless conspiracy theories about health in the context of the pandemic. And more recently as well, we've seen a lot in terms of climate change denial as well, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. So it's also important at this point to flag the CILIP ethical principles and framework, as this work should absolutely contribute to the point on information literacy, which is defined as the ability to think critically and make balanced judgments about any information we find and use. It empowers us as citizens to reach and express informed views and to engage fully with society. Now, this is what we should do as professionals, but what we should also consider is how this might impact the work we do within our community and with our peers as well. As a member, you have made the commitment to uphold, promote, and defend the development of information skills and literacy. And what this means for professional practice is that the development of information skills and literacy are central for information professionals as we create, curate, and enable the use of diverse types of information in an ethical manner, and we have a crucial role in advocating for these skills. And we'll examine exactly what this looks like with the contemporary problems which conspiracy theories present in this new day and age. So first, we're going to do a little bit of an experiment because this is our first time really properly using Menti. So I'll put the QR code up on screen just now. You can scan this with your phone, or you can go to www.menti.com and put in the code that is here. So I'll give people a little second to do that. And firstly, I'm going to ask the question, what do you think of when you think of conspiracy theories? I think also Kirsten might also share the link in the chat if she's able to. So I'm just going to move on. It'll take a wee second to load. But yeah, what do you think about when you hear the phrase conspiracy theory? So you can either put it into the chat box or you can use, oh, there we go. First one, fear. It's a big one. So, you know, it can be a lot of different things. Is it mind control? Is it aliens or Bigfoot? Is it a specific conspiracy theory? Is it a news platform or news story? Is it a person? Likely it's something that most reasonable people would find far-fetched, or perhaps something that isn't far-fetched, but it's secretive or believed to be a cover-up. Oh, there we go, there's tons.
54 responses, my goodness.
Thank you so much, everyone. There we go, that's great. So we've got, oh, big one, Trump. We'll talk a little bit about him later on. We've got tinfoil hats, government agencies, distortion, echo chamber, fake news, climate change denial. Nessie, that's a good one. There we go, seek truth, exclusion, confusion, isolation, QAnon. We'll talk about a little bit about that later on as well. Debate, media. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. 71 responses, that's amazing. Okay, so if I can share my screen again, Kirsten. Oh, there we go, here's some interesting ones. Concerned, worried, frustrated, hopeless as a librarian. That's sad, but hopefully we'll work on that a little bit today. Disbelieving, uncomfortable, amused, astounded, laugh, fair enough. Some of them can be quite funny. Incredulous, uncertain, anxious, uneasy, sick, unsettled. Yeah, absolutely. These are a lot of really great emotions. And what we'll do is we'll kind of come back to this later on and try and find some ways that we can actually try and work with some of these emotions to make some sort of credible change. So if we go back, and I'll share my screen again. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in that. It was really amazing to see. And as I say, we'll come back to some of these responses later on. So researching more into this, I found that it was a fairly under-researched area, but there were still some really valuable resources which I'll lean on and share with you today. All of my sources will be included in my presentation slides, which will be sent out afterwards, and also the session, as we know, is being recorded as well. All the kind of main titles are hyperlinks as well, so you should be able to click on them to find any of the papers that I had been using. So the main basis of this presentation will be from the UNESCO Addressing Conspiracy Theories, What Teachers Need to Know toolkit, which was presented as part of their Think Before Sharing campaign a few years ago. Whilst this is made with teachers in mind, we all know that librarians are teachers in their own right and are especially important in this discussion, not only because you're information professionals, but also because you have a unique relationship with the patrons of your library service. People may share things with a librarian that they wouldn't with a teacher or other authority figure. So to really begin to examine this topic, we must first understand what a conspiracy theory, misinformation, disinformation, and fake news is. You likely will have some sort of understanding of these words, but we have to set the context within the discussion today and really make sure that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. And luckily the toolkit outlines this for us. So conspiracy theory is the belief that events are being secretly manipulated by powerful forces with negative intent. Typically, conspiracy theories involve an imagined group of conspirators colluding to implement an alleged secret plot. The important words to highlight here are belief, negative, imagined, and secret. We've all heard the saying that just because you believe something doesn't make it true, and this is so relevant here. Central to a lot of this is finding out why someone believes something, because dismantling should start with questioning this core belief. Imagined and secretive give the impression of a certain elusiveness, which typically isn't the case with true facts and evidence, and we'll look at some examples of this later on. Misinformation is false or misleading content shared without harmful intent, although the effects can still be harmful. When people share and for example, this is when people share false information with friends and family in good faith. Any conspiracy theory can be considered misinformation if shared without the direct intent to cause harm. Disinformation is false or misleading content that is spread with an intention to deceive or secure economic or political gain, and it may also cause public harm. Conspiracy theories that are intentionally spread to cause harm and polarize society can be considered disinformation. So if we take misinformation and disinformation side by side in this context, we can use some examples to make the difference clear. Misinformation could, for example, be a relative sharing false information about health on Facebook or sending you a link to a false article privately because they are concerned about your safety or health. They are trying to act in good faith, trying to look out for a relative. Despite this care, however, the fact remains that this information is still false and could potentially cause harm to the recipient or others around them. Disinformation, for example, has been seen recently in the incitement of violence against people of colour and immigrant communities after the Southport attacks. A recent article from the Global Network on Extremism and Technology explains that within just hours after the attack, far-right accounts on social media platforms such as X began spreading misinformation, in which they falsely alleged that the perpetrator was a Muslim migrant who had recently arrived in the UK, while authorities later clarified that the perpetrator was a UK citizen born in Cardiff. The author of this article claims that this was done to align this tragedy with anti-migrant propaganda. And this clearly outlines the difference with mis and disinformation. It was done without regards to facts, intentionally to propagate a political agenda, whereas the first example was done thoughtlessly, but the person is seen to be trying to act in good faith. And finally, fake news, and this is where the little image of the tinfoil hats comes in, is defined as a subset of disinformation that is false or misleading information presented as news. While the term fake news is now used ubiquitously to disparage any unwelcome information, we see it a lot, Donald Trump uses the phrase a lot, the term originally referred to false or distorted news stories, which are usually sensationalist, designed to be widely shared, and also to generate revenue. Fake news can be used to support conspiracy narratives and can also be considered disinformation, as it is generally spread with a clear intention to influence public opinion. So now that we've understood what these terms mean and the difference in malintent but equal harm evident in all scenarios, I would love to get you to start thinking about any scenarios that you have been faced with. Have you seen something shared by a family member that you know to be false, or have you heard a library patron make a disparaging comment about vaccinations? We'll come back to these stories later, but I'd love for you to be ready to share them anonymously. It's really essential that we don't disregard conspiracy theories as radical fantasies made up and proliferated by select groups of people. The reality is that they exist in our everyday context. If you've scrolled Twitter or Facebook today, you've probably already come across one. Innocent or not, we're surrounded by them, but why exactly are they so harmful? The UNESCO guide paints the picture really well, headlining 5 different reasons why they're so harmful, and I'll take you through them now. Quite often with conspiracy theories, they will be used to target groups of people with black or white thinking, the kind of thinking which positions groups against one another, using either an inflated or imagined threat. And I'm quoting directly from the toolkit. They identify an enemy and a secret plot that threatens people's lives or beliefs and sparks a defense mechanism, which can fuel discrimination, it can be used to justify hate crimes, and it can be exploited by violent extremist groups. These negative sentiments can be extended to groups associated with the conspiracy theory, such as assumed allies of the conspirator. Perceived outgroups of society are especially prone to be targets of conspiracy theories. This includes people of different origin, religion, or sexual orientation. The toolkit suggests that there is a reduction of trust in public institutions through conspiracy theories, which position public institutions as ones to be fearful or skeptical of, and this leads people to political apathy and/or totally polarizes people. It proliferates this black or white thinking. It means that people are less likely to listen to different or varying points of view. It creates a real antagonism if someone doesn't agree with you. And to jump the gun slightly on this point, libraries, I believe, can have a big impact on this point, especially with work on digital, political, and civic literacy. Libraries are trusted public institutions. Librarians are voices of authority and reason within the community, reaching people that others can't. And they also don't come with the same controversy that politicians do at times. And just like a librarian would, I can prove this point with facts. Librarians are one of the UK's most trusted professions, which again is why you are so incredibly well placed to do this work and for it to have a marked difference. And we can see here, this information comes from the Ipsos Trust Veracity Index from last year. Librarians are 86% trusted to tell the truth. The toolkit says that conspiracy theories polarize society and may fuel violent extremism. They're used as a recruitment mechanism as well to justify violent extremism. Fake news and popularized stories also fall into this category, and we can see from examples such as the January 6th insurrection and Pizzagate scandal that there are oftentimes real-life consequences to these conspiracies. In extreme cases, people develop a saviour complex and will enact violence to avenge groups or people, which is a very real reaction to something that doesn't actually exist. And just to touch slightly more on the Pizzagate scandal and what that is, Wikipedia explains that Pizzagate is a conspiracy theory that went viral during the 2016 US election cycle, falsely claiming that the NYPD had discovered a paedophilia ring linked to members of the Democratic Party. It has been extensively discredited by a wide range of organisations, including the Washington, D.C. police. A member of the public, in an attempt to save the children, took a firearm to the Comet restaurant, which was accused of being at the epicentre of this, and set off shots in an attempt to self-investigate and free the children. People still to this day believe that Pizzagate is a true example, and it's something that comes up every US election cycle. We'll probably see it again. Hillary and Bill Clinton were both accused of being part of this scandal. And so obviously that was really big in the 2016 election. So they also claim that it reduces trust in science. Of this, the toolkit explains that they erode trust in scientific institutions, scientists, and scientific data. They probably wouldn't like this presentation very much. Conspiracy theory belief can drive people to defy public health guidelines and put others at greater risk of exposure to deadly diseases. This links back to the example of the relative or friend sharing false health information, which, although meant with good intentions, can pose a serious threat to others. Another example of this type of harm can be seen not only largely in health literacy, but also in climate literacy. For example, a paper called The Social Consequences of Conspiracism states that exposure to conspiracy theories about climate change has also been found to decrease people's intentions to reduce their carbon footprint, which, as I'm sure we can all acknowledge, poses a huge risk to the planet, especially if more and more people begin to think this way. If we can take this point out of the scientific perspective for a moment too, and just look at the data for a moment, this kind of thinking sits in direct opposition to librarians, who are the keepers and creators of reliable information and data, which again highlights how important the rest of this presentation is, as we'll look at the ways in which we can start to dismantle this type of opposition. Okay, mentee time again. I'm going to ask a slightly more controversial question, which is, are there any conspiracy theories that you actually believe in? Don't worry, this is completely anonymous, as you saw in the past two questions, and it isn't actually a trick question either, because as we discover later on in the presentation, some conspiracy theories are actually true. If we think about the Watergate scandal or the MK Ultra mind control experiments from the US government, these did actually happen, but later on we'll explore the difference between them and how credibility plays a massive role in this. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. Kirsten, if you could do the honours.
Yes, absolutely. I can see some already coming in, which is exciting.
That is exciting. I was worried that it was slightly too controversial for people to... the Royals are lizard people. Any David Icke fans in the house? I know way too much about this, unfortunately. Jeffrey Epstein, lots of political things as well. MK Ultra, exactly. Pharma is too commercial. There's a complex in the US that houses lots of alien crafts. Yep, Area 51. Kate and Jerry McCann were involved in Madeleine's disappearance. The moon landing has never happened. I'm sure you clocked the fact that I had actually used the moon landing as one of the background images. Area 51, aquatic ape theory. Not really a conspiracy, but not well accepted. Interesting. These are great. Believe governments cover up a lot of super shady stuff. Yeah, that wouldn't really be that surprising this day and age, would it? The spread of disinformation itself is a conspiracy. 9/11 actually created by the US government. Sleeper spies in the UK. Evolution, atomic theory. I don't believe in them, they just fit the facts. Love that. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for doing that again. That was a controversial one, but thank you for going with it, with that one. I will share my screen again. There we go. So yeah, thank you so much for participating. We've got one more question that kind of falls towards the very end, but thank you so much again for contributing to that. Kirsten was actually telling me a really good one about how Furbies, I think it's the new Joanne McNally podcast, Furbies are watching us. They weren't allowed in the Pentagon. So if you want to, I can recommend a lot of different rabbit holes for this topic. So I'm sure Kirsten can put a link to that in the chat maybe. So now that we know some of the main harms, we can begin to understand why people even believe in conspiracy theories in the first place. Because it seems outlandish that people in good faith would believe in things which would enact violence or erode trust in scientific or public institutions. But as we discover, it really isn't as simple as that. And, if there are any conspiracies that you believe in, again, we're all, I'm sure in the room, we're all rational people. So sometimes they're just our facts that don't add up, but we'll kind of delve a wee bit more into this as we go along. So one example is that they help to empower people when they feel powerless. When people feel vulnerable, isolated, or alienated from politics and political power, they are more prone to believe in conspiracy theories. Paradoxically, the belief that there is an evil plan to control events gives people a comforting sense of control and agency because it allows them to project their fears onto an imagined enemy. Another thing is that they explain unlikely events to some people. When highly unlikely or momentous events happen, most people find mundane explanations unsatisfactory. A lack of an explanation can have a similar effect. A conspiracy theory can satisfy people's need for a significant event to have a similarly significant cause. So we can take the Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, for example, which was a flight that took off and most of it has never been found. There have been some kind of scraps of it found within the sea. There are boundless conspiracies which state that a hostage attempt, government conspiracy, Bermuda Triangle-like vortex, or even aliens are responsible for this disappearance. Whereas it's most likely it was just a series of unfortunate but certainly plausible chain of events which took place and resulted in the factors surrounding this. It might satisfy curiosity to wonder what else might have happened, and healthy skepticism is always a good measure to avoid the rabbit hole. And I'm certainly not here to propose that we never watch another Netflix documentary again, but rather it's about examining when this type of thinking goes slightly too far. Conspiracy narratives are often more engaging and more accessible than official accounts. Complex phenomena are boiled down to simple explanations that are easier to understand. Conspiracy theory content is often crafted on eye level with those who believe in them. It uses simple language, videos, and images that trigger emotions that are more relatable than elaborate scientific texts or complex news stories. And again, librarians and information professionals are certainly no strangers to boiling down intense information overload in order to help people access robust, fact-checked information. But hopefully this is making sense to some people as to why conspiracies are often easier to believe at a first glance, especially with social media, as people just tend to read the headlines these days and they don't actually read the content of the article. So, if you take that at face value, it can become quite problematic. Conspiracy theorists rarely believe in only one conspiracy theory, but rather they develop a complete worldview. Conspiracy theories follow a common structure. They feature a group that orchestrates a secret plot, a hidden agenda or goal, a cover story to hide the conspiracy, and also a proxy group that helps implement the conspiracy. This pattern can be easily transferred from one conspiracy theory to another, making people who believe in one conspiracy more susceptible to believe in several. Interestingly, what I've discovered since researching this topic is that perhaps unsurprisingly, the reason that people gravitate towards conspiracy theories or find them interesting is because they somewhat scratch certain itches in our brain. One such example is a phenomenon called pareidolia, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I did hear people say it out loud, so I hope that is the correct pronunciation. The best way to describe this is through example. So if I were to tell you to look up into the sky at the clouds, naturally our brain is going to want to try and make shapes out of those clouds. But if I ask you to not do that, to not find any sort of recognizable shapes, not let your brain make out any shapes or animals in the clouds, it's going to be quite difficult because that is what our brains are accustomed to doing. Our brains are used to filtering and collecting information and mostly relying on its accuracy, making connections between these pieces of information. So, we can look out into the sky and see the shape of a tiger, but we know that it isn't actually a tiger. And we can make that difference. But if something's been fed to us as reliable information, it can be a little bit harder to see that difference. So pareidolia is the phenomenon where our brains see faces and recognizable shapes within other things. And this is similar to the ink blot test as well, which is why I've got this on the screen. And also, I just thought this image of the pepper was fairly Halloween-y, so it felt appropriate. So at times, conspiracy theories, when shared in a specific way, relate to this part of our brain, which seeks to find answers, connect facts, and explain phenomena. And linking back to my last point, social media these days churns out so much information accredited to anyone with a phone. So the chains of connections, which once served us accurate information, can no longer contend with the amount of false information we're accustomed to seeing. So in a way, it's kind of retraining our brains to kind of more effectively filter this information. And again, this can either be for ourselves or it can be on behalf or to support our patrons to do this as well. So in relation to this understanding of why people believe in conspiracy theories, it's important to emphasize why people's curiosity needs to be led in the right direction in the first instance. The paper Rethinking Information Ethics, Truth, Conspiracy Theories and Librarians in the COVID-19 Era shares why libraries are so central right now in this post-pandemic period. The author claims that COVID-19 created an urgency for fast and reliable information in order to save lives and protect vulnerable people. And I hope I'm not triggering anyone if we try and think back to that point in time where there was so much information coming out about the disease at the first stages. But the internet, the place most people went to for this information, had already been politicised to the point that librarians were already fighting misinformation and disinformation surrounding conspiracy theories, meaning that this platform for reaching people already posed a disadvantage to this information sharing. Uncertainty, anger, and fear, especially in relation to health, and again, this also applies to climate as well, they all contribute to conspiracy thinking, especially when key actors are using this emotive thinking to push political agendas and different frames of dissonance in the public discourse. A different paper called Do the Research, Conspiracy Theorists in Public Libraries by Timothy Cole-Hale suggests that individuals looking to engage in conspiracy discourse and research may well actually use the library to do this, which again highlights the importance of librarians being able to spot this behaviour and conduct early intervention where appropriate. And that is key, where appropriate, and we'll kind of touch on that later on. On a similar thought, the paper Information Literacy in the Age of Internet Conspiracism posits that telling people to do their own research isn't an effective way to mobilise change in these conspiracist behaviours, because it is curiosity which leads into the hands of forums and places such as QAnon, which I know came up earlier on in our Mentee. The paper goes on to explain that QAnon began in 2017 as a series of cryptic anonymous posts on the image board website 4chan from an individual or individuals claiming to be a Q-level intelligence operative within the Trump administration, leaking sensitive information about an impending revelation of shadowy dealings within the deep state. These revelations were believed to culminate in a cataclysm known as the Storm, which sounds very ominous, in which high-level politicians, celebrities, and elites would be indicted for various satanic practices involving children. Q called upon all patriots to help expose evildoers through a complex research process, and the theory spread globally, infiltrating various online non-profit organisations. QAnon's radical ideology sparked multiple acts of mass violence and directly contributed to the January 6th insurrection. Unfortunately, people looking for a solution to a problem or unknown will often give up or give in to the first explanation they see. And this is why critical thinking and questioning must remain central to dismantling these threads. Donald Trump, for example, said, "It's up to American patriots to arm themselves with information." In an investigation of the January 6, 2020 insurrection at the US state capitol, the Washington Post investigation claims that measures of online mayhem surged alarmingly on Facebook, with user reports of false news hitting nearly 40,000 per hour. On Facebook-owned Instagram, the account reported most often for inciting violence was @RealDonaldTrump, the president's official account, the report showed. This scenario explains that people believe that they are arming themselves with information, and they may so instead be arming themselves with disinformation, which aligns with their political beliefs rather than the truth. Timothy Cole examines this point too, saying that information literacy is still required because even if patrons use academic databases, they may find a misleading headline that reads something along the lines of "Donald Trump declares opioid crisis a national emergency." Now, it's true that Donald Trump did actually say these words. However, he never went through Congress and informed health provisions, making it a legitimate national emergency. Therefore, information literacy skills are still necessary to put the materials that we find into better context, and also to help patrons do that. So at this stage in the presentation, you might be asking yourself, what sets the difference between a conspiracy theory or a logical suspicion or healthy skepticism about something? So firstly, I'm going to show you a little table created in the UNESCO guide to hopefully show the nuances in conspiracy theories versus healthy or reasonable suspicion. And further to this table, UNESCO have broken conspiracies down into 7 main things to look out for in order to identify them. So this table from the toolkit outlines the differences between conventional thinking on the left and conspiratorial thinking on the right. The left-hand side uses the example of the Watergate scandal, which was a government cover-up of a crime committed by the administration of President Nixon. It would be logical to assume that if you were to come home from work and your door is lying open, that someone may have broken in. And the same logical conclusion, further backed by a deeper trail of evidence after investigation, can be reached. The initial discovery of something not quite right in this circumstance was followed with evidence. They strove to make sense of this evidence. It eventually unfolded into an actual conspiracy, but this wasn't their end goal. So I was actually on jury service last year, and the idea of confirmation bias came up quite a few times. Now, this is the idea that you could use evidence to support a theory that you already have pre-established in your head, rather than letting the evidence lead you to a final conclusion. And it's the same idea if you watch any sort of true crime. It's like, when they want to pin something on a suspect, they'll make the evidence fit them rather than letting the evidence, as I say, take them to their final suspect. The same can be said for a lot of conspiracy thinking, seen specifically in the second half of the table. This is a conspiracy theory which was made up to prove the ridiculousness of them in the first place, but it ironically went on to become something that conspiracists believed, telling that birds are robots used by the government to spy on civilians, and they charge by sitting on power lines. We can see here that the overriding suspicion is distrust in the government, and there's not been any information to actually prove that this is true in any way. So it is peddled by this belief rather than by evidence. It leads to confirmation bias and an overinterpretation of certain factors. The factors tend to contradict themselves, but it never stops conspiracists in believing in them. The example here being that the government must produce eggs to hide the fact that there are no real birds to produce them. These factors all produce a redundant conspiracy theory, and hopefully you can see the difference between the two halves of the chart now that I've kind of covered it. So the first way to identify a conspiracy is that it's contradictory. The underlying belief driving conspiratorial thinking is commitment to the idea that the official account must be wrong. One result is that conspiracy theorists are attracted to multiple ideas that conflict with the official account, even if those ideas are mutually contradictory. One study found that people who believed the conspiracy theory that Diana of Wales was murdered were also likely to believe that she also faked her own death. Conspiracy theorists are so committed to disbelieving the official account that it does not matter if their belief systems are completely incoherent. So another example of this from the toolkit, again using climate change denial, suggests that these two things go hand in hand. Climate change deniers often lean on conspiracy theories and contradictory evidence to validate their own narratives. A paper titled The Alice in Wonderland Mechanics of the Rejection of Climate Science states that the different arguments seen in climate disagreements often contradict each other, such as the simultaneous claim that the temperature cannot be measured accurately, but that global temperatures have declined. And again, both can't be true at the same time. So here we have a few of the other ways to identify a conspiracy theory. So the first is overriding suspicion. While it's important to have healthy skepticism when assessing claims and information, conspiracy theorists take this to extremes, exhibiting nihilistic levels of skepticism towards institutions, scientific information, and official accounts. A telltale red flag of conspiratorial thinking is extreme skepticism of scientific data. This overriding suspicion prevents the belief in anything that does not fit into the conspiracy theory. So the next one is nefarious intent. Conspiracy theories often include villainous conspirators whose motives are assumed to be nefarious. This is part of the reason why conspiracy theories are engaging and attractive to some people, employing compelling narratives of evil villains and assuming agency and intent to explain random events. Conspiracy theories never propose that the presumed conspirators have benign motivations. They are always evil. The next is that something has to be wrong. The driving force behind conspiratorial thinking is the rock-solid belief that the official account is based on deception. Consequently, new information or arguments may cause conspiracy theorists to abandon specific parts of their theory when they become untenable, but the underlying conviction that something must be wrong doesn't change. The next is the persecuted victim. Other common characters in conspiracy theories are heroic victims, and these are the theorists themselves. Conspiracy theorists see themselves as victims of organized persecution. Simultaneously, they also believe that they are brave heroes fighting against the odds to bring down the all-powerful conspirators, the good versus evil discussion. The next is that they are immune to evidence. The overriding suspicion of conspiracy theorists makes it extremely difficult to change their mind and convince them that their theory is wrong. This is because any evidence you present that shows a theory is false is reinterpreted as being part of the conspiracy. And it's that idea of, yeah, well, you will say that because you're part of it. This can manifest in several different ways. If there's no evidence to support a conspiracy theory, that only proves how effective the conspirators were in hiding their activities. Conversely, if there is strong evidence against the conspiracy theory, the conspiracy is subsequently expanded to include the source of the evidence as being part of the theory. And finally, we have reinterpreting randomness. Pattern detection is a common feature in conspiracy theories where random, unrelated events are weaved into a broader, interconnected pattern where nothing occurs by accident. Any perceived connections are imbued with sinister meaning. For example, a random fact, such as the intact windows in the Pentagon after the 9/11 attacks, was reinterpreted as evidence for a conspiracy theory, because if an airliner had hit the Pentagon, then supposedly all of the windows would have shattered. This again links to the idea of pareidolia, the idea that you can connect separate factors in your brain rather than leaving it as a coincidence. So I want to take a step away from the toolkit for one moment to have a look at something which I came across, which circulated through library Twitter in the wake of the UK riots a few months ago. It's called the SIFT strategy, and this is a 4-step guide to spotting misinformation, especially designed to support users on social media, and it was designed by digital literacy expert Mike Caulfield. This is something you yourself can practice, or something which you can point patrons to as a framework for beginning this work in sifting through information on a quick and fairly easy basis. In an article by Amanda Ruggieri, which shares the method, she describes that there are many reasons why misinformation travels so quickly. According to some research, it travels even faster than accurate information. One reason is that people are far more likely to share a claim when it confirms their pre-existing beliefs, regardless of its accuracy. This cognitive bias may help explain why even more information seems to be shared by individuals than by bots. One study, for example, found that just 15% of news sharers spread up to 40% of fake news. From this scary statistic, she shares that although this seems dire, the reality is that more thoughtful considerations around what we share can make a huge difference in that figure. So the SIFT strategy goes as follows. S is for stop and asks us to rethink the urgency of any information we might be sharing. Often social media creates a false sense of urgency that actually doesn't exist. Equally, content shared can be emotive and tempt us to share it as it hits our endorphins or any other emotive hormonal response of that sort. Secondly, I is for investigate the source. Now, there are multiple good parts to this second step. They suggest that you come off of the platform to do a little secondary research about the source, and they suggest some questions to consider. So these are, if the creator is a media outlet, are they reputable and respected? And do they have a recognised commitment to verified independent journalism? If it's an individual, what expertise do they have in any of the subjects at hand? What financial ties, political leanings, or personal biases may be at play? If it's an organisation or a business, what is their purpose? What do they advocate for or sell? Where does their funding come from? What political leanings have they shown? And finally, they ask you to consider whether you would believe this creator if they were saying something that you disagree with. This is a good sense check as it asks you to consider how valid and believable you find this person or source in the context of challenging your own beliefs. F in this scenario is for find better coverage. If you still have unanswered questions from the first two parts, then this is your opportunity to find other and more reputable coverage of the same thing. If the same sentiments are echoed in sources you trust, then it's probably okay to go with your gut and share the source or one of those instead. In fact, I actually did this recently when my friend sent me a random creator's reel, one that I didn't recognise, about One Direction singer Liam Payne dying after an accident in Argentina. The source looked pretty dodgy, so I came off of Instagram and I opened Google. I typed in his name and I pulled up the news tabs. Instantly, I saw that various places such as The Guardian, CNN, and The Independent were all reporting the exact same headline. So from that, I could assume that it was safe. Especially in this scenario, because it happened in Argentina, a mistranslation of a simple word from Spanish to English could mean misinformation spreading like wildfire. And finally, T is for trace the claim to its original context. Using the same scenario, if, for example, the CNN report of the singer's death links to the original article, and assuming that my Spanish is much better than it actually is, then you could go to the original source which it was first reported from. Another way to think about this is that photographs and videos have recently begun to be misinterpreted, misrepresented, or people can now use artificial intelligence to augment videos too. And quite often it's actually hard to tell if videos have been augmented without putting them through software. So sometimes finding the original uploader of a file can lead you to the original context. We saw this as well with an example of the Pope. There was one where he was dressed in like a big like Kanye West puffer jacket, and it turns out they could find the original image of the Pope dressed in his like normal garbs, and then they could see the fact that this secondary image had been augmented. So we're going to go back to Mentee now. Kirsten, this is your cue. And this is going to be our final question. And luckily it's multiple choice. So we just need to consider what your reaction would be if you were confronted with a conspiracy theory in real life. I'll stop sharing. There we go. So how would you react to hearing a conspiracy theory in your workplace from a colleague or patron? Would you completely ignore it and not think about it again? Would you completely dismiss it entirely, but still think about it and maybe question that person's understanding? Would you try and understand their perspective, ask them a little bit, some follow-up questions, or would you ask them to prove it and for their source? Okay, interesting. That's good. It's good that no one is willing to ignore it or completely dismiss it either. But I mean, sometimes that's okay as well, because it all depends on what type of conspiracy theory it is. If it's really far-fetched, really, they're really ingrained in it, sometimes the best thing is to ignore it, because you're just going to end up in an argument, and that's going to kind of limit any ability for you to try and turn them around on that thinking. So sometimes to ignore it is actually okay. And we'll look into this a wee bit further in a minute. But yeah, interesting. Most people would ask them to prove it or for their source, which I think is really probably, out of all these options, that is the best one. And there we go, Bruce is saying that they'd try to do both. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for answering that again. And now we do the dance of resharing the screen. There we go. Okay, so again, thank you so much for participating in that. That was our final switcheroo of the day. So now we're going to take a look at practical ways of dismantling conspiracies and what you can actually take away from this session. So one of the first things we can do is to check our own beliefs and biases. Everyone has their own baggage, and without reflection, we might even have conspiracies that we hold on to which are damaging and that we haven't acknowledged yet. So part of starting this work is to check ourselves. Hopefully some of the reflections that you've given today have started that work, and you might even have taken stuff away from what other people have said as well. And we'll try and share the results of the mentees with the slides and everything as well, in case you'd like to have a second look at that. The second thing we can do is build resilience against conspiracy theories. Trying to limit the spread of conspiracy theories is more productive and effective than trying to undo the damage with someone who already believes in them. With these two things in mind, this next section focuses on preemptive measures to build resilience against them. So pre-bunking helps to prevent the spread of conspiracy theories by addressing the problem in more general terms. Pre-bunking exercises do not focus on one conspiracy theory specifically, but they may alert to the existence of conspiracy theories in the context of specific topics. So for example, we have COVID-19 or climate. It might be against specific groups like Jewish communities, or for general strategies and rhetoric used in conspiracy theories like scapegoating. The aims of this can be seen on screen right now. So it's to warn learners early that conspiracy theories exist. There's no use in trying to ignore them and pretend that they don't. Encourage rational thinking, questioning, and fact-checking, and alert learners to the arguments behind the most common conspiracy theories, manipulation techniques, and also the key traits of conspiratorial thinking. There are also two ways to pre-bunk claims. Logic-based inoculation aims to explain the misleading techniques or flawed reasoning employed in conspiracy theories. For example, teach learners about the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking to help learners spot the same misleading techniques when navigating information online and offline, or use the SIFT strategy as well. Fact-based inoculation claims to explain to learners how the conspiracy theory is false by communicating accurate information. This approach is most effective before learners have begun conspiratorial thinking. Another and perhaps better known approach to addressing conspiracy theories is debunking. It focuses on dismantling a specific conspiracy theory to show that this argumentation is flawed and its message is false. Debunking can be learned. It goes hand in hand with general critical thinking, research skills, and media and information literacy. Learners need to be encouraged to critically examine information they consume. They need to know where to turn for reliable and fact-checked information and learn techniques to fact-check themselves. There are various ways to debunk conspiracy theories, some of which mirror the approaches described in the pre-bunking section. So again, we have fact-based and logic-based. So fact-based debunking shows how misinformation is false by researching and explaining facts. This approach has been shown to be effective in debunking the birther conspiracy theory, which falsely holds that former US President Barack Obama was born outside of the US, and that would have made him an illegitimate president. But people were able to look into the archives, find his birth record, and find that he was actually born and raised in Hawaii. And then we have logic-based debunking, which explains the misleading techniques in misinformation. For example, pointing out vaccination research has been conducted by independent, publicly funded scientists is effective in refuting conspiracy theories about the pharmaceutical industry. And that basically means that you're not pointing to research that is done within the pharmaceutical community to peddle that. It means that you are looking at independent sources rather than ones that might be perceived to be like, oh yeah, well, they're just part of the conspiracy. It's much harder to prove that if it's an independent source. So then we have empathy-based debunking, which compassionately calls attention to the targets of conspiracy theories and the potential of conspiracy theories to cause harm and violence. And again, we can look at things like the Pizzagate scandal and the January 6th insurrection, which actually posed harm to the people who believed in the conspiracy theory. Then we have source-based debunking, which discredits those who spread conspiracy theories, leading learners to distance themselves from them. This approach does not work in firm believers of conspiracy theories, and I'm sure you'll be able to kind of tell the ones that might work and that might not work. And it really is about using your judgment to assess how far that person is in their beliefs, and then using what you believe to be appropriate. So then we have the do's of debunking, which is focus on the facts that you want to communicate, not the myth that you want to debunk. So focusing on the positive rather than the negative is a really good way to think about that. Choose one target, so either the author, the source, or the logic behind the conspiracy theory, because you don't want to overwhelm anyone. And again, we'll see something that maybe slightly contradicts this in a few minutes, but again, it's up to you to use your professionalism to determine what suits that particular scenario. Always state clearly that the information is wrong before quoting a conspiracy theory. And again, we'll hear something that says that you should never actually repeat the conspiracy theory in the first place. Provide a fact-based alternative explanation. So rather than just saying you're wrong, saying you're wrong because, or here's actually what I think is happening. And that's a much better way to kind of have that conversation, because people don't like being told that they're wrong. And I think a big part of this is, if someone were trying to convince you of something that you know to be true, convince you that that is false, how would you be susceptible to hearing about that and be open to maybe believing that it was or wasn't true? And if possible, use visual aids to back your arguments. And I'll share some resources at the end of some really good toolkits and presentations that already exist. And again, feel free to use these slides as well, as we'll share them later on. The don'ts of debunking are kind of just like the kind of flip side of those. So don't focus on the conspiracy theory first. You might inadvertently reinforce it, and don't overwhelm with information. So further on this, and as I said, in contrast, in his paper, Tim Cole also emphasises what not to do in trying to dismantle conspiracy theories. He states that you should never repeat the mis or disinformation that you are trying to combat. This is because of the illusory truth effect, which is where the more times information is repeated, even if it is a lie, the more likely it becomes that people will accept it as truth, even when it is being disputed. You know, you hear that quite often in social media. If someone says, if you see an article once, you'll maybe go, that doesn't seem right to me. You see it a few more times and you start to believe, oh, maybe that could be true. But that is at the point where that intervention is really important for you to go and do that for yourself and look on other sources and use something like the SIFT strategy. He further states that if inoculating people is no longer viable because the conspiracy theory is so widespread, the Centre for Science and Democracy suggests amplifying accurate stories from credible sources, reporting and flagging inaccurate content, and building relationships by talking to people who believe in misinformation and encouraging others to follow the same steps. In addition to avoiding the illusory truth effect, they also suggest that under no circumstances should you attempt to sway individuals through fear, anger, or shame, because it just will not work. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what to do. Avoid ridicule. Try to understand why they believe what they believe. Aggressively deconstructing, ridiculing a conspiracy theory, or focusing on beating the conspiracy theorist in an argument runs the risk of being automatically rejected. Think of how you would feel if someone did that to you. You just wouldn't be willing to listen. Affirm critical thinking. Conspiracy theorists perceive themselves as critical thinkers, while considering non-conspiracy theorists as gullible and duped into believing an official account. This perception offers an opportunity to connect with conspiracy theorists by appealing to the shared value of critical thinking, then encouraging them to apply this approach towards a more critical analysis of their theory, in line with the aforementioned debunking exercises. Again, if someone believes that they are coming to their own conclusion, they'll be much more likely to believe it than if you try and dismantle it for them. So kind of working with them to kind of do that, then that seems to be a more effective way. Show empathy. Somebody who believes in a conspiracy theory may often be truly fearful and distressed. And this is why I kind of asked you that question at the beginning about how you feel about it. Think about, channel these feelings into thinking about how that person may feel if they truly believe what they believe. As the goal in the conversation with a conspiracy theorist is to develop their open-mindedness, you should lead by example by similarly being open-minded. This can be demonstrated with an empathetic approach, seeking to build understanding with the other party. And it's that age-old adage of treat people how you want to be treated. Model respectful and civil behaviour. Learners will observe your behaviour and may modify their behaviour accordingly. Allow learners to finish speaking before another begins. Do not assign blame, openly disagree, or chastise, but instead respectfully share accurate information and counter arguments from a variety of sources. Used trusted messengers. Counter messengers created by former members of an extremist community, also known as exiters, are evaluated more positively and remembered longer than messages from other sources. So check whether messages are at your disposal either online or within your community. And we see this with the example of Scientology, the kind of plethora of documentaries that have come out from exiters like Leah. Don't push. Too much pressure might actually backfire. Focus on simple facts and logic instead of covering every detail. Instead, encourage open debate and questions. Leave learners time to process new information in logic-based arguments. After all, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So don't create an environment where people automatically feel like they're on the defensive. I am aware that it has just went 11 o'clock, so if anyone needs to leave, that's completely fine. This is my second to last slide. So this is just some extra resources, and you'll be able to find these when we send the recording and also the slides out. I did promise that we would have our go at debunking our own conspiracy theory, but there was too much content to actually fit in this. But a game that I would recommend is the Go Viral game. And that's a kind of a game where you try and spread as much disinformation and misinformation as possible to try and go viral. And it's, again, that theory that we've been using throughout the whole presentation of understanding the mechanics of how something like that works and how something does go viral with misinformation, because it's quite unbelievable at times the amount of misinformation that exists. So that's a really great game. It takes about 5 minutes. You can do it yourself with colleagues. You can do it with classes or learners. It's a really great resource. We have the UNESCO Toolkit, which I've been covering kind of throughout. We have the Media and Information Literacy Community of Practice, which have just released their new website, which I'm sure we can put the link to that in the resources, and well, it's on the slides here, but also in the chat. That has a kind of history of really great resources about media and information literacy. And I believe that there's more to come. And so if you'd like to get involved with the community, you can reach out through that website. We have the Climate Change Debunking Handbook, which I didn't really touch on in this session, but that's a really great handbook as well. We can maybe do a specific session about climate change debunking at some point in the future. The UNESCO How to Spot and Fight Disinformation. That's a kind of presentation as well, which you could use with learners. That is really great, and it has a lot of activities within it, so I would highly recommend having a look at that. And then we have the Reinforcing Ethics and Values for Effective Advocacy for Libraries Toolkit. Very well remembered on the title of that. I've written it down so many times that I memorized it. And that was a toolkit that we funded through a research fund through Dr. David McMenemy. And that's a really good toolkit about using advocacy or using ethics and values within library advocacy. And it touches on a lot of the sort of stuff that I shared here. So that's a really great free to access resource, which is on the CILIPS website. You can watch all 10 videos for free and share it widely and openly if you would like to. And also, just to highlight, in the future, we're hoping to have David on for a CILIPS podcast special all about conspiracy theories as well. So we'll touch on a lot of that work then. And yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure how many people are still with us, but if there's any questions, I would be happy to take them at this point. And thank you so much for your time and your attention as well.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much for your time as well. That was so well researched and so much really, really useful and practical tips in there. So thank you so much for all your work on that. Yeah, there's loads of really positive comments saying how useful it's been in the chat. So I'll not even go through them all because there's so many there. Thanks to everyone else who has been sharing lots of other links and resources, lots of recommendations for podcasts and other things. So I think there's so much stuff out there around this, and it's really interesting to start seeing where different sectors are on this, because we're all trying to tackle it in different ways. So thank you to everybody for adding those links. I'm just looking to, I don't think we've got any specific questions. So I think everyone's just been delighted with the content there. I think I think Bruce had a question about your background, but I'll get you to pick up that. I'll get you to email on the answer to that. We'll save the chat. So yeah, I think with the time going just 11:05, we'll wrap up there. Thanks for all your comments. We'll email, once we've got the video downloaded stuff, we'll email that round with some of the links and some of the information as well. Yep, somebody just asked if there's any CILIP posters we can display about disinformation. I know CILIP did a lot of the work around Facts Matter, and there was lots of badges around that. Actual information about misinformation, disinformation, I'm not sure. So that's something we could perhaps look at and think about whether there's something we could either fund or provide, because that could be a really useful tool for people to display in the libraries. And there's maybe stuff that I don't know about. So if anyone does have stuff that isn't CILIP led, then please do stick a link in the chat before you go. Okay, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leah. And that was a really, really engaging and visually pleasing presentation as well. So thanks all. And Paul says, IFLA has a good poster, 8 tips to avoid fake news. So do click the links in the chat before you go. Thanks all. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday and happy Halloween again.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.